Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So I think a couple of videos ago, or in several videos, I've talked about how I really wanted to get back into using my alcohol markers again, as it's actually one of my favorite mediums to use when working traditionally, especially for, I guess, color payoff, the seamless kind of like blending capability you can get, as well as just like how vibrant the colors can be. So here's like a really quick look at some of the more finished looking drawings and illustrations that I've done with alcohol markers through the past few years. So there's kind of like a combination of just like normal alcohol markers, pastel ones, gray tones right here. But a lot of these I actually still really like. But today we are going to be using some alcohol markers, as the lovely people at Arrtx actually sent me their Arrtx sketch markers, and this is their, I believe, set B, and they are a 90 set of alcohol markers. And it comes in this really cute kind of like periwinkle, soft purpley blue colored kind of case, and you can kind of see the color selection on the very back side, and there's a lot of like vibrant pastel and gray tones that I see like immediately. But upon opening the box, and a thing about the box actually, one thing I really love about the design is the fact that the lid turns into kind of like a stand. This always scares me. I'm not too sure if I'm just being too rough with it, but if you kind of crack it open and lay it on its side, it is tilted in such a nice way that helps display all your markers, and they just like don't spill out, which I really like. But also included in the box, we get our little swatch sheet. So I talked about this in the past, that if a product does not come with its swatch sheet, which luckily this one does, I actually have a separate sketchbook where I keep both my swatches for different supplies alongside with just using it as a scratch pad so I can test out colors, try to figure out color combinations and all that. But before we actually start to do our color swatches for this particular set, let's take a look at the markers itself. So this is the sketch marker from this 90B set, I guess. So the barrel itself is really smooth. It's nice and kind of like a weighty kind of feeling, but it also has like a triangular rounded barrel, which prevents it from rolling too much, as well as that I find that it's kind of like a nice grip for when you're using it for long periods of time. Definitely good for people who have kind of like the tripod grip, or if you're like me, kind of like the quadrupod type of grip. So these markers actually have a brush tip on one end, which is kind of more of like a flexible nib that has like both thick and thin, while the other side is the fine tip, which is better for smaller details and more consistent lines. So let's go ahead and look at our swatch sheet. So there is actually 2 boxes per each swatch, so I decided to do it this way. Ended up using the left side of each box for the brush tip, and then on the right side of each box I decided to use the fine tip, but I ended up doing kind of more of like vertical hatching instead, because I didn't really see a need to do both. I guess if I'm just filling in a square, I feel like it will have like pretty much even coverage all the way around. I also screwed this up, so I ended up using some sticker paper to correct my mistake. So while I correct that and I do the rest of the swatches, let me talk about one pet peeve I have about this particular set just right away. It's nothing like really detrimental or anything, it's just more of like an inconvenience. So upon opening the marker set, the order of the swatches and the order of the markers are not the same. So I highly recommend you rearrange your markers in your preferred way and then do the swatches. I'll put a picture of what they look like before and after I sorted. So yeah. So really quick demonstration, if you're not familiar with alcohol markers, one of the benefits of using alcohol markers is their blending capability. Now this might depend on your paper type as well, just how well it can hold up a wet medium, as well as like how does it hold just these types of markers, I guess. So you might have to do a little bit of testing. So I decided to pick out a gradient going from a darker blue to 2 mid-tone-ish type of purples into kind of like a peachy tone. And for the most part, you have pretty good blending. Now I'm gonna say this right off the bat, to get really nice seamless blending, for the most part for all alcohol markers, you should have good transition colors in between each color that you're trying to blend together. And what I mean by that is that the kind of like gradation and the blending capability of the peachy kind of like sunset colors that I have near the bottom, like the one that I'm currently working on, has a much more seamless blend compared to the purple or the blue, purple, pink gradient. I find that it's easier to transition colors if they're kind of like closer in range of value. So I'll probably talk about that a little bit more once we start coloring. Another benefit is layering of color. So I decided to show you guys how you can make like a very kind of cute pastel-y green using a blue and a yellow. You can see what it looks like if I mix kind of the peachy tone alongside with the blue as well. So there's some benefits of using alcohol markers versus some other markers, but we'll touch upon even more stuff once we get to the drawing portion. So going in my sketchbook, we are going to be quickly doing a little bit of a test with the alcohol markers in my sketchbook because I know it works somewhat well on this particular paper. It's a very smooth notebook paper, but I find that the way the alcohol markers blend on it works pretty nicely from my past attempts. So before we do that, I am going to do line work. So I'm showing you guys that when I work with alcohol markers, I found that using water-based markers don't really budge or smudge too much with using in conjunction with alcohol markers. So I like using these water-based markers as kind of like my base for my line work, and I like to use typically 2 colors minimum for these ones. So kind of similar to how I work digitally, I like to lighten up my sketch to a point where it tends to be a little bit more on the softer side and leaning very warm, more or less kind of matching the skin tone for the most part. But once I start to do rendering and cleanup and sharpening up lines, I like picking darker colors to kind of make my line work pop forward. So we're going to be doing the same thing. I decided to start with kind of like an orangey red color for the base for Dan Heng, and then after that we'll start doing the coloring first, because all I'm doing is using the orange lines kind of like as my base, but it also works as majority of the line work towards some lighter areas that I want it to be warm, such as like faces? Yes, the facial features like ears, nose, mouth, around the eyes, and then later on we can decide how dark or how cool we want to transition those lines to be later on. So I'm gonna share a tip, or I guess like more of like a recommendation maybe, and it's not specific to alcohol markers, but more specific to if you're using something new, I recommend using it in conjunction with something you're familiar with. So typically, this could be like applicable for both traditional and digital art, but for these new markers, I want to be able to test the markers on their own without having to fuss about like other areas. So don't try to make everything difficult for yourself. So if you're not used to using alcohol markers, don't also try to make a new character and try like a new style altogether. Otherwise, you might get frustrated in all 3 aspects and not figure out whether or not is it the alcohol markers that are making you frustrated, is that the fact that you couldn't make a new character, or is it the style that you chose, etc. So for today, because I am like fairly familiar with using alcohol markers, like I mentioned in the beginning, that it's one of my favorites for the color payoff and just like the way how they seamlessly blend. And from the most part, I guess like a lot of you guys say that a lot of my alcohol marker drawings kind of resemble my digital art, which I'm thankful for. But because of that, I felt confident-ish enough to use these alcohol markers today, but because alcohol markers typically still differ from different brands, you still should test them out. So I wanted to draw something very, very, very familiar to myself, which is Dan Heng. So even though the result at the very end is not my favorite in terms of how I drew him, I still had a very good experience using these markers. And it's a good test to work also kind of smaller-ish, I guess, so that I can complete a piece and see how I feel about it. So kind of like the final step after working with the markers for the most part is adding in our darker lines, like I mentioned. So typically I like to darken up any areas that have more like areas of higher contrast or lines that overlap. So typically a lot of places that have like corners or points meeting, you can add a lot more contrast to kind of like create depth. So I'm kind of like focusing my purple color in those areas. For this one in particular, I think because I needed a lot more saving of this particular piece, it's a lot more heavily darkened lines compared to the orange lines that I used in the beginning, which I usually don't recommend doing because I like having the orange kind of like pop out here and there. I also wanted to show you guys a comparison. So alcohol markers are great for blending, but you can also use them if you just want flat color. So that's what I've done in the past if I ever wanted to do some doodling. And this side. So this side actually has the ghosting, which is a lot, or like the bleed through. So I think I forgot to mention earlier, if you have like thinner paper or you know alcohol marker is gonna bleed through, please put like a piece of plastic or a piece of paper underneath so that you can catch the bleed through to protect both your desk and or your subsequent other pieces of paper in your sketchbook. But moving along, we're gonna work on something much bigger, probably almost, I think, 3 times bigger than my sketchbook. I have already done a sketch digitally in Procreate, which I'll add the time lapse in the little corner. And today we're drawing Sampo from Honkai Star Rail. For some reason, I'm in a Star Rail mood, so we're gonna be drawing some Star Rail characters. So after drawing Sampo in Procreate, I ended up bringing it into Clip Studio Paint and creating a canvas of, I think, 8.5 by 11, so the size of a normal sheet of printer paper. And we're going to basically tile our sketch because I need it to be able to fit nicely on an 11 by 14, I believe is what this piece of paper is, around that size. If not, it's like somewhere on the screen earlier. But once it's printed out, we tile it, we tape it. We're going to be using also a light pad because I am going to be transferring my sketch directly onto my drawing surface or my drawing paper. So the paper that I'm using is actually, I think it's Bristol board, or I think it's drawing vellum, Bristol vellum, something like that. I've used the Strathmore brand several times in the past, and it's my favorite to use both with colored pencils, graphite, and surprisingly alcohol markers because it can hold up quite a bit of layering for the most part with very minimal bleed through. I guess you'll see a lot of ghosting but no bleed through. So I'll probably show you guys at like some point about that. But we're using the light pad today because I wanted to be able to transfer my sketch directly. And because this is kind of like a free-flowing piece of paper, I don't have to transfer it the weird way, which I usually do, or like using carbon paper, etc., like I do for my watercolor paintings. But for this one, the light pad shines a very bright light underneath my sketch, and my sketch is placed underneath my Bristol vellum. So because of that, I can see what my sketch looks like underneath, and I'm just going ahead and using the water-based markers, or water-based fine liners, similar to before, to do our line work. So instead of doing a sketch like I usually do for watercolor, I'm just going in directly with inking because I feel confident enough that hopefully my digital sketch is clean enough that I can actually interpret my lines. So this is what the sketch looks like. Also, I'm using my power bank to charge this because for some reason none of my cables were working. But this is what my sketch looks like, or the line art I guess looks like after turning off the little lights from my light pad. So it's very clean. I used the more like reddish pink this time rather than orange to kind of better match with Sampo's color palette. So this is our sketch underneath. I also recommend, if you're using a thicker paper like the Bristol vellum that I'm using, I highly recommend having your sketch also on your phone or a different device so you can reference it. There's some places where the papers were overlapping, which made it very hard for me to see where Sampo's chin was or like where his hand was, so I had to have a separate sketch also somewhere else so that I could reference it. But we can move on to our coloring, which I felt very intimidated. And I'm glad I started with the ear, so I decided to start with a smaller section because we're working a lot larger compared to the Dan Heng drawing that I did in my sketchbook. So for me, I wanted to plan out how I wanted to tackle kind of like coloring in his skin portion. Because I think from what other people have seen, as well as what I've said earlier, is the fact that alcohol markers lay pretty flat. And I think that's like one of the biggest benefits of using alcohol markers. And these Arrtx ones kind of like lay down really nicely, so I didn't really have too much of an issue. But you can still get some streaking or some weird overlap if you're not using the alcohol markers in a way that you can kind of like seamlessly cover and or hide those marks. So if you're using like water-based markers, you're gonna have a lot of streaking whenever you go over and over an area and have overlap. Where that overlap happens tends to get a lot darker, but with alcohol markers, it's a little bit more subtle. I find that moving in the direction of like your object helps the most. This is like very helpful during like when you're coloring in hair. But for the skin in particular, I like working in circular motions. There are some areas you can see that I probably overlapped a little bit too much color, but oftentimes if you take a lighter color or the same color and just go over another layer of that same color, you can kind of like even things out a little bit more easily. Also, I was a little bit hesitant when I was coloring the skin. So I think I was not able to show it directly on the screen because for some reason I was just off camera. For some areas of Sampo's skin, I had a hard time adding enough warmth without going too crazily pink like I did with Dan Heng's piece. So sometimes you'll see I will pick up a lighter pink color and dab it with one of the red colors. So I'm basically taking the brush tip to the other brush tip and hoping that the reddish color kind of bleeds into the pink color of the brush tip. I'm dabbing it kind of like the excess on a scrap piece of paper and then going back in and hopefully darkening up some of those places very subtly and just building it up, because I needed some other colors to help transition some of my blends, and I didn't want to have that harsh of a transition, because if you're using much lighter colors with blending with something that's very, very dark and you're just forcing them to blend, oftentimes the blend that you get in the center is just gonna look like a diluted version of your dark color, where you can see where the alcohol is kind of like pushing the pigment and it leaves kind of like of a hazy aura around it, and it's not really seamless. So I recommend, if you can, try to plan out your gradations with similar valued colors. And what I mean by that is like the colors that I chose here are kind of similar-ish in terms of when I was doing the blues, which you saw me like take out. So I would go from a dark blue, which probably be one of the darkest colors in Sampo's hair. Then I would transition it with something that maybe is like 2 values kind of lighter. And I kind of like want to shift it lighter and lighter every time. That way the jump from even this minty blue that I'm using right now, we're not going to be hopefully mixing that with our first kind of like darkest blue. Otherwise they're gonna struggle to blend. So I feel like that's like something maybe people who are not familiar with using alcohol markers is not like really aware of, because you might be blending with something super light with something super dark, and you always hear about people saying, oh, alcohol markers blend really, really nicely, you get like seamless blending, and then you try blending those 2 colors and you probably think like, I don't know what people are talking about, these colors are clearly not blending. So you do have to be aware of, hopefully have like a 3-step transition if you're going from light to dark or dark to light. So at least have like your dark color, a mid-tone or transitional color, and then your lighter color. Otherwise, as long as like they're in the same value-ish, they kind of like blend pretty seamlessly and with not too much effort. So I think right here, I'm starting off with one of the darkest blues I think I was using for Sampo's hair. I already laid down a layer of kind of like the lighter-ish blue because I was trying to plan out how I wanted to do his hair. But you can see that I ended up picking another blue to kind of hopefully blend it out a little bit, because you can kind of play around with also the intensity of the blending. So, or I guess like in this case, I'm more or less overlaying colors and layering it and making things kind of just achieve more of like a softer blend-ish type of technique, I guess. Because some areas I'll leave with like sharper edges, and oftentimes a lot of my darker colors will kind of like hit that tip or that point, and as we move down and want things to be softer, I often get lighter and lighter. But it's good to have like a contrast of both, I find, especially for hair. So for me, oftentimes where the band of highlight is, right under it, I like having as dark of a shadow as I can. So there's some areas that I'll keep like trying to push. Even like right now, I think that his hair is lacking a little bit of some contrast. So I went in with a dark gray and I was not really liking it. It looked too muted to me. And I remember that Sampo's hair is like very much, it's a blue, but it leans more of like a purpley blue. So I ended up taking one of my darker reds and layering it on top of Sampo's hair and then blending it out with the dark blue again. So we can kind of achieve like a darker, rich purple instead of just having a dark, cool gray, almost mute the colors that I had initially, which could have been great if you wanted that look, but it just looked like it was washing out his hair color a lot. And then kind of the same thing for the drink. So for some reason I decided to make the darker portion at the top instead of the bottom, but I did kind of the same thing. We're using a dark blue. I'll try to transition 2 dark purples in between to try to get it back to our fluorescent pink. So it's not the most seamless blend for this one, but I didn't really mind. I do think it looks more intense on camera, because if you see my camera kind of almost flickering or making things look very pale and almost like a white cast is over it. For some reason, my camera was having a hard time focusing on some of the colors. So because of that, it's picking up some of my darker colors as black almost, and it's making that drink look really intense right now, which it is fairly vibrant and dark, but it shouldn't be like reading as black at the very top. So hopefully you'll be able to see it at the very end at least. But my experience using the alcohol markers from Arrtx has always been like a very lovely experience. I feel like their ink quality is very nice, the color payoff is very nice as well, and they blend fairly nice. But like I said, I think it might depend on different papers that you use. I find that, actually, I haven't used it on printer paper or one of the cardstocks that I have as of recently, so I can't really say whether or not these work really nice on them. But on this Bristol kind of like vellum alongside with my notebook paper, the blending capability has always been nice. I definitely think the bleed through is like very much the same as like any other alcohol marker brands. And let's talk about the tips, because I think these would get kind of like a mixed reaction, or at least it is for me. So I think 98% of, well, I guess I used it a little bit more towards the end. Let's say like 95% of this drawing is done just purely with the brush tip. I find the brush tip so versatile, and I do like the ones from Arrtx. They have like nice flexibility, but it has like also a nice firmness to it, so it's not like squishing down too badly if you're using it. So if you have maybe a heavier hand, you're not accidentally getting only large marks, because that's kind of like the benefit of using a brush tip for alcohol markers especially. So typically when you're blending out colors, the brush tip makes for more of a seamless blend, and hopefully with less effort, because if you do more of like tapering or flicking kind of motions, you can kind of make your brush marks fade almost towards like the end of your brush stroke, and because of that, you're able to hopefully have a little bit more of a gradation in one brush stroke, and allows your colors to blend a little bit more seamlessly. Because there's some areas on the face and the hair where I'm not actually like physically blending everything super intensely, and I'm letting kind of like the value and the layering kind of like take over, and because of that, it kind of still gets like a nice softer transition as long as you're kind of like flicking the markers in a certain direction. If you're using it more like upright and just like as is, you kind of get the sharper lines and more of like that bolder look. But because of that, the brush tip I find so versatile, because like you can use the very tip of the marker to get very thin lines if you have like very light hand pressure, and then you can use the full marker itself to fill in larger areas and block in just bigger areas in general, because you're using the entire width of the brush tip itself. While the fine tip, or some other brands might call it a bullet nib, it's a very firm tip for the marker, and it's at like a very I guess it's like an okay size, technically. It depends on what you're using it for. I used it for some of the bubbles in Sampo's drink because I used the colorless blender to hopefully kind of disperse some of the ink around to lighten up some areas for the bubbles. And I used it for the outlines for our little background box here, which I'm doing right now. And it's good for consistent small lines, I find, but it would be difficult to blend a lot with it, or I feel like it would just require a lot more effort, if anything. I think I've used the chisel tip a lot more than I do with like the fine tip or the like bullet nib, just because I do find that if you have a good brush tip, I don't think you really need too much of like technically either of them. But they each have their own uses, as well as if you're a little bit more heavy-handed, I can see yourself using maybe more of the fine tip or like the bullet nib a lot more, because it's at a very much like a small consistent size, so you don't have to worry about squishing down too hard. It'll be very good if you want to do like maybe a dot texture, or if you want to do very consistent fine lines in general. So it's still really nice to have. I just don't really typically use what's on the other side of these brush tip markers unless it's like a fine liner. I think that would be very interesting. I don't know how that would ever work. But speaking of fine liners, so like I mentioned way before, is that I usually like choosing 2 different line arting colors. So this is no exception. We started off with kind of like a pinky red color for our initial line arting color, and then after that I switched over to a dark blue because I wanted enough contrast between Sampo's hair, and I feel like it worked pretty nicely. I'm just doing some final touches and embellishments with a white gel pen, and then I'm using kind of like a hot pink fluorescent gel pen to make his name pop from everywhere else. I was not too sure if I wanted to use white, but I actually think the kind of fluorescent pink works out really well with this, so yeah, I'm kind of pleased, at least with how I think this looks. Also, kind of like a neat thing you can do if you find using a white gel pen too intense on your drawing, you can always use a alcohol marker right back on top and kind of like tint it, I guess, or like, you know, kind of add a little bit of a color to it, which is still a lot lighter typically of your normal surface, if that makes sense. But here's the sketch with the final of Sampo. I actually really like it. I was very nervous going in with coloring Sampo because he was at much of a larger scale, and luckily the markers work so well that you can see that things were very much not patchy, which is great, especially for the skin, and I had a lot of fun working with them. So yeah, if you guys like the look of alcohol markers and maybe this is one of your first sets, I do recommend this marker set. I do think that it does have very much like 3 color families, like your brights, your pastels, and your grays, so it's a very good starter set as well. So thank you again to Arrtx for sending me these markers, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!